The autumn wind of 1886 howled through the Black Hills like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant echo of pickaxes from Deadwood's gold mines. Lonely Rancher pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes as he guided his horse, Thunder, along the treacherous mountain path. At 43, he had grown accustomed to the solitude that came with driving cattle across these unforgiving lands. His weathered face told stories of countless storms weathered alone, and his calloused hands spoke of years spent working the land without a soul to call family. The people of Deadwood knew him only as the quiet cowboy who delivered cattle to the stockyards twice a month, never staying long enough for conversation, never accepting invitations to the saloon. They whispered about his past. Some said he'd lost a wife and child to cholera. Others claimed he was running from the law. The truth was simpler and more painful. Lonely Rancher had chosen isolation after losing everything that mattered, believing that caring for others only led to heartbreak. Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story. As darkness settled over the hills like a heavy blanket, Thunder suddenly reared. His ears pricked forward in alarm. The horse's nostrils flared, sensing something that made him dance nervously on the rocky path. Lonely Rancher dismounted, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt 45 at his hip. The silence was broken only by the wind and the distant howl of a coyote. "Easy, boy," he whispered to Thunder, scanning the shadows. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it, a whimper, barely human, echoing from the mouth of Devil's Cave. The cave had earned its ominous name from the local Dakota tribe, who spoke of it as a place where lost spirits wandered. Most folks in Deadwood avoided it, especially after dark. But Lonely Rancher had never been one to believe in superstitions. He lit his lantern and approached the cave entrance, the flickering light dancing across the jagged rocks. The whimpering grew louder as he ventured deeper into the cave. His boots crunched on loose gravel, and the air grew thick with the musty scent of dampness and decay. 20 feet into the darkness, his lantern illuminated a sight that stopped him cold. A child, no more than 8 years old, lay curled against the cave wall. The boy's clothes were torn and filthy, his small frame trembling from cold and fear. Rope bound his wrists and ankles, and a dirty cloth had been stuffed in his mouth as a gag. But it was the child's eyes that struck Lonely Rancher like a physical blow, wide with terror, yet somehow still holding a flicker of hope. "Jesus Christ," Lonely Rancher breathed, dropping to his knees beside the boy. His hands shook as he carefully removed the gag, then worked to untie the ropes. The child's lips were cracked and bleeding, his skin pale as moonlight. "Who did this to you, son?" The boy tried to speak, but only a raspy whisper emerged. "Water, please." Lonely Rancher quickly retrieved his canteen, supporting the child's head as he gave him small sips. The boy's eyes never left his face, as if afraid this rescuer might disappear like a mirage. As the ropes fell away, Lonely Rancher could see the angry red marks they'd left on the child's wrists. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked gently, wrapping the boy in his own coat. "Tommy," the child whispered. "Tommy Morrison." The name hit Lonely Rancher like a thunderbolt. Morrison. He knew that name. Judge Morrison was one of Deadwood's most respected citizens, a man who'd made his fortune in the gold rush and now served as the town's primary magistrate. But Judge Morrison had no children, or so everyone believed. "Morrison?" Lonely Rancher repeated carefully. "Are you related to Judge Morrison?" Tommy's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded weakly. He said I was a mistake, said I had to disappear." The implications crashed over Lonely Rancher like an avalanche. A respected judge with a secret child abandoned to die in a cave. This was bigger than anything Deadwood had ever seen. But right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was the dying child in his arms. "Well, Tommy Morrison," Lonely Rancher said, lifting the boy carefully, "you're not disappearing on my watch. We're getting you out of here." As he carried Tommy toward the cave entrance, the boy's small hand clutched his shirt. "Are you going to leave me too?" Tommy whispered. Lonely Rancher paused, looking down at the child who reminded him so painfully of the son he'd lost years ago. In that moment, something shifted inside him. A wall he'd built around his heart began to crack. "No, son," he said firmly. "I'm not leaving you. Not ever." Thunder waited patiently as Lonely Rancher emerged from the cave with his precious cargo. The horse seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, standing perfectly still as his master mounted with the child cradled in his arms. As they rode toward town, Tommy fell into an exhausted sleep against Lonely Rancher's chest. But even as he held the boy close, Lonely Rancher's mind raced with questions. How had Tommy ended up in that cave? Who had tied him up and left him to die? And most importantly, what was he going to do about Judge Morrison? The lights of Deadwood flickered in the distance like fallen stars, and Lonely Rancher knew that bringing Tommy back would change everything. He was about to challenge one of the most powerful men in town, and he had no idea what consequences that might bring. As Thunder's hooves echoed through the night, carrying them toward an uncertain future, Lonely Rancher made a silent promise to the sleeping child in his arms. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he would protect Tommy Morrison, even if it meant standing alone against the entire town. The lonely cowboy who had spent years avoiding human connection was about to discover that sometimes saving someone else was the only way to save yourself. Dawn broke over Deadwood like a reluctant witness, casting long shadows across the muddy streets as Lonely Rancher carried Tommy into Doc Hartwell's clinic. The boy had developed a fever during the night, his small body burning against Lonely Rancher's chest as they rode through the darkness. Doc Hartwell, a gruff but kind-hearted man who'd seen more than his share of suffering in the gold rush town, took one look at Tommy and immediately cleared his examination table. "Good Lord," Doc muttered, carefully examining the rope burns on Tommy's wrists. Who would do such a thing to a child? Lonely Rancher stood by the window, his jaw clenched as he watched the doctor work. "That's what I aim to find out, Doc. But right now, he needs help." As Doc Hartwell cleaned Tommy's wounds and checked for signs of serious injury, the boy drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally calling out for his mother. Each cry pierced Lonely Rancher's heart like a knife, reminding him of his own son's final moments years ago. "He's severely dehydrated and malnourished," Doc reported, covering Tommy with a clean blanket. "Looks like he's been in that cave for at least 3 days, maybe more. Another day and—" He shook his head grimly. "But he'll be all right?" Lonely Rancher asked, his voice rougher than usual. "With proper care, yes. But he'll need time to recover both physically and mentally. This kind of trauma—" Doc paused, studying Lonely Rancher's face. "You planning to take him to the sheriff?" Lonely Rancher was quiet for a long moment, watching Tommy's peaceful face as the boy finally slept soundly. "I'm not sure the sheriff's the right man for this, Doc. This goes deeper than you might think." Before Doc Hartwell could respond, the clinic door burst open. Sheriff Bradley entered, his badge glinting in the morning light, followed by 2 men Lonely Rancher recognized as Judge Morrison's associates, Marcus Webb, the town's banker, and Samuel Cross, who owned the largest general store in Deadwood. "Heard you brought in an injured child," Sheriff Bradley said, his eyes immediately focusing on Tommy. "We came as soon as we heard." Lonely Rancher stepped protectively closer to the examination table. "Word travels fast in this town. Too fast sometimes," Webb said smoothly, his calculating eyes studying Tommy's face. "Poor child. Do we know who he is? Where he came from?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Lonely Rancher met Webb's gaze steadily, sensing the undercurrent of tension in the room. These men weren't here out of concern for Tommy's welfare. They were here for information. "Says his name is Tommy," Lonely Rancher replied carefully. "Found him in Devil's Cave, tied up and left for dead." Cross exchanged a quick glance with Webb. "Devil's Cave? That's dangerous territory. What were you doing out there so late?" "Driving cattle," Lonely Rancher answered. "Lucky I was, or this boy would be dead by now." Sheriff Bradley moved closer to Tommy, studying the child's features with an intensity that made Lonely Rancher's instincts scream danger. "Funny thing," the sheriff said slowly. "This boy looks familiar. Can't quite place where I've seen him before." "Children all look alike when they're sleeping," Doc Hartwell interjected, sensing the tension. "What matters now is his recovery." Webb stepped forward, his voice taking on an authoritative tone. "Of course, Doctor, but we need to consider the proper procedures. An abandoned child should be placed in the care of the territorial authorities. Judge Morrison handles all such cases." The mention of Judge Morrison's name sent a chill through the room. Lonely Rancher's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but he forced himself to remain calm. "The boy stays here until he's well enough to speak for himself. Now see here," Cross began, his face reddening. "You can't just—" "I can and I will," Lonely Rancher interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down rustlers and outlaws. "This child was nearly murdered. Until we know who did it and why, he's under my protection." Sheriff Bradley's hand moved to his own weapon. "That's not your decision to make, Cowboy. The law says a man has the right to protect the innocent," Lonely Rancher cut him off. "And that's exactly what I'm doing." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring until Tommy stirred on the examination table, his eyes fluttering open. The boy looked around the room with confusion and fear until his gaze found Lonely Rancher's face. Immediately, his expression relaxed. "You didn't leave," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. "Told you I wouldn't," Lonely Rancher replied gently, moving to the boy's side. "How are you feeling, son?" Tommy tried to sit up, but Doc Hartwell gently pressed him back down. "Easy there, young man. You need to rest." As Tommy's eyes adjusted to the light, he noticed the other men in the room. His face went pale, and he shrank back against the pillow, his small hand reaching for Lonely Rancher's arm. "It's all right," Lonely Rancher assured him. "You're safe now." But Tommy's reaction hadn't gone unnoticed. Webb and Cross exchanged another meaningful look, while Sheriff Bradley's expression grew darker. "Perhaps we should let the boy rest," Webb suggested, his tone deceptively casual. "We can discuss the proper arrangements later." As the three men filed out of the clinic, Webb paused at the door. "Be careful, Rancher," he said quietly. "Sometimes good intentions can lead a man into dangerous territory." After they left, Doc Hartwell shook his head. "Those men are up to something. I've been in this town long enough to recognize the smell of corruption." Lonely Rancher nodded grimly. "Tommy, I need you to tell me the truth. Are you Judge Morrison's son?" Tommy's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded. "My mama worked for him. She died last month. The fever got her." "And what happened after that?" "The judge said I was a problem. Said people couldn't know about me because it would ruin him. He gave me to some men, told them to make me disappear." Tommy's voice broke. "They said they were taking me to an orphanage, but instead they took me to that cave." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in Lonely Rancher's mind. Judge Morrison, the pillar of Deadwood society, had fathered a child with one of his servants. When the mother died, the child became a liability, living proof of the judge's moral failings. Rather than face the scandal, Morrison had arranged for Tommy to be eliminated. "Those men who came here," Lonely Rancher said carefully, "do you recognize any of them?" Tommy nodded fearfully. "The one with the badge. He was there when they took me. He told them which cave to use." The revelation hit Lonely Rancher like a physical blow. Sheriff Bradley wasn't just complicit. He was part of the conspiracy. The very man sworn to protect the innocent was helping to cover up attempted murder. As the afternoon sun slanted through the clinic windows, Lonely Rancher realized the full scope of what he was up against. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge. It was about a network of powerful men who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But as he looked down at Tommy's trusting face, Lonely Rancher felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. This child needed him, and for the first time since losing his own family, he had something worth fighting for. "Doc," he said quietly, "I'm going to need your help, and we're going to need to be very careful about who we trust." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the Black Hills, and Lonely Rancher knew that the real battle was just beginning. 3 days had passed since Tommy's rescue, and Deadwood was buzzing with whispered conversations and sideways glances. Word of the mysterious child found in Devil's Cave had spread through the town like wildfire, despite the efforts of Judge Morrison and his associates to contain the story. Lonely Rancher had moved Tommy to a small room above the general store owned by Martha Henderson, one of the few people in town he trusted completely. Martha was a widow in her 50s who'd lost her own son to a mining accident 2 years prior. She'd taken one look at Tommy and immediately opened her heart and home to the boy. Her fierce protection of children was legendary in Deadwood, and even Judge Morrison wouldn't dare cross her openly. "That boy's been through hell," Martha said as she prepared breakfast for Tommy. "But he's strong, reminds me of my own Samuel at that age." Lonely Rancher sat at the small table, watching Tommy carefully eat his porridge. The child's physical wounds were healing, but the emotional scars ran deep. He startled at every unexpected sound and refused to let Lonely Rancher out of his sight for more than a few minutes. "We can't hide here forever," Lonely Rancher said quietly. "Morrison and his men are getting desperate. They've been asking questions all over town." As if summoned by his words, heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs outside. Martha's hand moved to the shotgun she kept behind the counter as the door opened to reveal Father McKenna, the town's Irish priest. His weathered face was grave with concern. "Thank the Lord you're all safe," Father McKenna said, removing his hat. "I've been hearing disturbing rumors, and I felt compelled to see for myself." Lonely Rancher studied the priest carefully. Father McKenna had arrived in Deadwood only 6 months ago, but he'd quickly earned a reputation for standing up to the town's more corrupt elements. Still, in a situation this dangerous, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. "What kind of rumors, Father?" Martha asked. "That Judge Morrison is claiming the boy is mentally unstable, making up stories about being his son. He's petitioning the territorial government to have the child committed to an asylum in Denver." Father McKenna's Irish accent thickened with emotion. "They're saying the trauma of being lost in the wilderness has driven him mad." Tommy looked up from his breakfast, fear flickering in his young eyes. "What's an asylum?" "A place where they put people who are sick in the head," Martha explained gently. "But you're not sick, sweetheart. You're just scared, and that's perfectly normal." Lonely Rancher's jaw tightened. An asylum would be the perfect solution for Morrison. Tommy would disappear forever, and his claims would be dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed child. "How long do we have?" "The territorial representative arrives tomorrow," Father McKenna replied. "Judge Morrison has considerable influence with the government. Unless we can prove the boy's claims." "We need witnesses," Lonely Rancher said. "Someone who knew about Tommy's mother. Someone who can verify his story." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "Sarah Williams might help. She worked as a seamstress for many of the wealthy families, including Judge Morrison. If anyone knew about a secret child, it would be her. Where can we find her?" "That's the problem," Martha said grimly. "She left town suddenly 3 weeks ago, right around the time Tommy's mother died. Some say she went to visit family in California, but you don't believe it," Lonely Rancher finished. Before Martha could respond, Tommy spoke up in a small voice. "Miss Sarah was nice to me. She used to bring me candy when she came to see Mama. She said she was going to help us leave Deadwood and start over somewhere safe." The implications were chilling. Sarah Williams had likely discovered Morrison's plan and tried to help Tommy and his mother escape. Her sudden disappearance suggested that Morrison's reach extended further than anyone had imagined. Father McKenna leaned forward intently. "There's something else you should know. I've been asking discreet questions around town, and I've found others who are willing to speak out. Mrs. Chen, who runs the laundry, says she's seen Judge Morrison visiting the house where Tommy lived with his mother. And old Pete, the stable hand, claims he overheard Morrison arguing with Sheriff Bradley about cleaning up loose ends." "That's not enough," Lonely Rancher said. "Morrison will discredit them all. We need solid proof." Tommy tugged on Lonely Rancher's sleeve. "I know where Mama kept her papers. Important things that the judge gave her. She hid them in a special place. All three adults turned to look at the boy. What kind of papers, son? Lonely Rancher asked gently. Letters. And a paper that said I was his boy. Mama called it a birth certificate? Martha's eyes widened. If we could find those documents, it would prove everything, Father McKenna finished. But the house where they lived, it's been boarded up since the mother died, and it's right in the heart of town, where Morrison's men patrol regularly. Lonely Rancher was quiet for a long moment, weighing their options. Breaking into the house would be dangerous, but it might be their only chance to save Tommy from a fate worse than death. Where exactly did your mother hide these papers? He asked Tommy. Under the loose floorboard by the fireplace. She showed me in case something happened to her. Tommy's voice grew smaller. She said the judge might try to hurt us if people found out about me. The sound of horses approaching made them all freeze. Martha peered out the window and cursed under her breath. Morrison's here, with Sheriff Bradley and 3 other men. Lonely Rancher moved quickly to the window. Judge Morrison sat tall on his black stallion, his silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. Even from a distance, his cold blue eyes radiated authority and menace. Sheriff Bradley flanked him, along with Webb, Cross, and a man Lonely Rancher didn't recognize. Probably the territorial representative. They're coming up, Martha whispered urgently. Heavy boots thundered on the stairs, followed by a sharp knock on the door. Open up, Mrs. Henderson, Judge Morrison's voice commanded. We're here on official business. Martha looked to Lonely Rancher, who nodded grimly. There was nowhere to run, and hiding would only make them look guilty. She opened the door to face the 5 men crowded on her small landing. Judge Morrison, she said coolly, to what do I owe this honor? Morrison stepped into the room, his presence immediately dominating the small space. His eyes found Tommy, who had moved to stand behind Lonely Rancher's chair. I've come for the boy, Morrison said simply. This charade has gone on long enough. What charade would that be? Father McKenna asked, stepping forward. Morrison's gaze shifted to the priest with obvious distaste. This child is clearly disturbed, Father. The trauma of being lost has caused him to create elaborate fantasies. He needs professional help, not the misguided sympathy of bleeding hearts. He's not disturbed, Lonely Rancher said, rising to his feet. He's telling the truth, and you know it. Morrison's laugh was cold as winter wind. The truth? According to whom? A half-wild cowboy who spends more time with cattle than people? A priest who's been in town less than a year? This boy needs medical attention, not encouragement for his delusions. The territorial representative, a thin man with nervous eyes, stepped forward. I'm Commissioner Walsh from the territorial government. I have the authority to place this child in protective custody, pending a full evaluation. Tommy pressed closer to Lonely Rancher, his small hand gripping the cowboy's shirt. Please don't let them take me, he whispered. Lonely Rancher's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he forced himself to remain calm. Starting a gunfight with Tommy in the room was not an option. The boy stays here until we can prove his claims, he said firmly. Sheriff Bradley's hand moved to his weapon. You're interfering with official business, Rancher. Stand aside. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Martha clutched her shotgun, Father McKenna positioned himself protectively near Tommy, and Lonely Rancher faced down 5 armed men with nothing but determination and the knowledge that he was fighting for something bigger than himself. Gentlemen, Father McKenna said quietly, surely we can resolve this without violence. Give us 24 hours to present evidence supporting the boy's claims. If we cannot provide satisfactory proof, he'll go willingly. Morrison's eyes narrowed. You have until sunset tomorrow. But if you cannot produce concrete evidence, not hearsay, not speculation, but proof, the boy comes with us, and anyone who interferes will face the full consequences of the law. As the 5 men filed out, Morrison paused at the door. You're playing a dangerous game, Rancher. I'd hate to see you get hurt. After they left, the room fell silent except for Tommy's quiet sobbing. Lonely Rancher knelt beside the boy, pulling him into a protective embrace. We're going to get those papers, he promised. Tonight, when the town's asleep, And then we're going to show everyone exactly what kind of man Judge Morrison really is." But even as he spoke the words, Lonely Rancher knew they were running out of time. Morrison was desperate now, and desperate men were capable of anything. The next 24 hours would determine not just Tommy's fate, but the soul of Deadwood itself. Midnight hung over Deadwood like a shroud as Lonely Rancher crept through the shadows toward the boarded-up house where Tommy and his mother had lived. The autumn wind whistled through the empty streets, carrying with it the distant sounds of revelry from the saloons and the occasional bark of a dog. Father McKenna waited with Tommy and Martha, ready to spread word throughout the town if Lonely Rancher didn't return by dawn. The house stood at the end of a narrow alley, its windows covered with rough planks and its door secured with a heavy chain. Lonely Rancher had studied the building from every angle during the day, noting the loose board on the back wall that would provide entry. As he pried it away with his knife, the wood creaked ominously in the stillness. Inside, the house was thick with dust and the lingering scent of sickness. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, casting eerie shadows across the abandoned furniture. Lonely Rancher lit a small candle, shielding the flame with his hand as he made his way to the fireplace Tommy had described. The floorboard was exactly where the boy had said it would be, slightly raised near the hearth, with nail holes that suggested it had been removed many times. Lonely Rancher pried it up carefully, revealing a small cavity beneath. His fingers closed around a cloth bundle, and his heart raced as he felt the crinkle of papers inside. But as he stood to examine his find, the sound of approaching horses made him freeze. Through a gap in the boards, he could see torches moving down the alley. At least 6 riders, led by Sheriff Bradley. Morrison had anticipated this move. Quickly, Lonely Rancher blew out his candle and stuffed the papers inside his shirt. He had seconds before they surrounded the house. The back window was his only escape route, but it would require him to break through the boards and risk being seen. "Surround the house," Bradley's voice commanded from outside. "He's in there somewhere." Lonely Rancher drew his knife and began working frantically at the boards covering the back window. The wood was old and brittle, but the nails held stubbornly. Behind him, he could hear men positioning themselves around the building. "Rancher," Bradley called out, "we know you're in there. Come out now, and we'll go easy on you." The first board came free with a sharp crack that seemed to echo like a gunshot. Lonely Rancher froze, listening for any sign that he'd been heard. When no immediate response came, he continued working on the second board. "Check the back," someone ordered. Footsteps approached the rear of the house just as Lonely Rancher freed the second board. The opening was barely large enough for him to squeeze through, but it would have to do. He could see the silhouette of a man rounding the corner of the building. With no time to spare, Lonely Rancher dove through the window opening, rolling as he hit the ground. The man spotted him immediately and raised his rifle, but Lonely Rancher was already moving, using the darkness and his knowledge of the town's layout to his advantage. "He's running," the man shouted, "heading toward Main Street." Gunshots echoed through the night as Lonely Rancher zigzagged between buildings, using every shadow and alley to evade his pursuers. The papers pressed against his chest felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. They were Tommy's only hope for freedom, and possibly his own only chance for survival. He reached Martha's store just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. Father McKenna was waiting at the back door, his face tense with worry. "Thank God," the priest whispered. "We heard the shooting. Did you find them?" Lonely Rancher nodded, pulling the cloth bundle from his shirt. "Everything Tommy said was true, but we've got bigger problems now. Morrison knows we have the evidence, and he's not going to wait for sunset." Inside, Martha was barricading the windows while Tommy huddled in the corner, his eyes wide with fear. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and soon the building was surrounded. "This is Sheriff Bradley," the lawman's voice boomed from the street. "You're harboring a fugitive and interfering with official business. Send out the boy and the cowboy, and the rest of you won't be harmed." Father McKenna moved to the window. "We have evidence that proves the boy's claims," he called out. "Evidence that Judge Morrison tried to have him murdered." "The only evidence here is of your own criminal behavior," Morrison's voice replied. "You have 1 minute to surrender, or we're coming in." Lonely Rancher quickly examined the papers he'd retrieved. There was Tommy's birth certificate, clearly identifying Judge Morrison as the father. Several letters in Morrison's handwriting promised to provide for the child and his mother. And most damning of all, a recent letter ordering the mother to remove the boy from Deadwood permanently or face severe consequences. "These papers prove everything," Lonely Rancher said grimly. "But they won't matter if we're all dead." Martha checked her shotgun. "Then we make sure they matter. Father, can you get word to the honest folks in town? Tell them what we've found?" Before Father McKenna could respond, the sound of splintering wood announced that Morrison's men were breaking down the front door. Lonely Rancher positioned himself between Tommy and the entrance, his Colt .45 ready. But instead of Morrison's men, a crowd of townspeople poured through the doorway. "Mrs." Chen led the group, followed by Old Pete, several miners, and a dozen other citizens that Lonely Rancher recognized as the honest working folks of Deadwood. "We heard the shooting," Mrs. Chen announced. "Figured you might need some help." Behind them came more people: the blacksmith, the baker, several of the saloon girls who'd grown tired of corruption, and even some of the miners who'd been cheated by Morrison's crooked deals. Within minutes, the small room was packed with determined faces. Sheriff Bradley appeared in the doorway, his gun drawn, but he stopped short when he saw the crowd. "This is official business," he said uncertainly. "All of you need to leave immediately." "The only one leaving is you," the blacksmith growled. "We're tired of your corruption, Bradley. Time for some real justice in this town." Judge Morrison pushed through the crowd, his face red with rage. "This is preposterous. I am a duly appointed judge, and I will not be intimidated by a mob of rabble." Lonely Rancher stepped forward, holding up the papers. "Then explain these, Judge. Explain why you tried to have your own son murdered." A gasp went through the crowd as Lonely Rancher read aloud from the birth certificate and letters. Morrison's face went pale as the evidence of his crimes was laid bare for all to hear. "Those are forgeries," Morrison sputtered. "Obvious fabrications designed to—" "To what?" Father McKenna interrupted. "To expose the truth? These documents are in your own handwriting, Judge. Everyone in town knows your script." Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived in Deadwood since its founding. "I saw you visiting that house, Morrison. Saw you arguing with the boy's mother just days before she died. We all knew something wasn't right." More voices joined in, each person adding their piece of the puzzle. The stable hand confirmed overhearing Morrison's plans. The seamstress's neighbor revealed that Sarah Williams had been frightened for her life before she disappeared. Even some of Morrison's own servants spoke up, describing the judge's violent temper and his threats against anyone who crossed him. As the weight of testimony mounted, Sheriff Bradley began backing toward the door. But the crowd blocked his path and several of the miners stepped forward to relieve him of his weapons. "Looks like we need a new sheriff," one of them announced. "Someone who actually serves the people instead of corrupt judges." Tommy, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally stepped forward. His young voice carried clearly through the room as he looked directly at Judge Morrison. "You told those men to kill me," he said simply. "You said I was a mistake that needed to be fixed. But I'm not a mistake. I'm your son, and my mama loved me even if you didn't." The simple dignity of the child's words seemed to break something in the crowd. Several women began crying, and even some of the hardened miners wiped their eyes. Judge Morrison, seeing his power crumbling around him, made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "You fools don't understand what you're doing. Without proper leadership, this town will fall into chaos. You need me." "What we need," Martha said firmly, "is justice, and that's something you've never provided." As the sun rose fully over Deadwood, the crowd made their decision. Judge Morrison and Sheriff Bradley were placed under citizen's arrest, to be held until territorial authorities could arrive to conduct a proper trial. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and their corruption had finally been exposed. But the real victory was quieter and more profound. As the crowd dispersed, many of them stopped to speak with Tommy, offering words of encouragement and promises of support. The boy, who had been abandoned to die in a cave, was now surrounded by an entire community determined to protect him. Lonely Rancher knelt beside Tommy as the excitement died down. "Looks like you've got a whole town full of people who care about you now, son." Tommy looked up at him with eyes that had lost their haunted look. "But you're still gonna stay, right? You promised you wouldn't leave me." Lonely Rancher felt something shift in his chest, the final wall around his heart crumbling completely. "I'm not going anywhere, Tommy. If you'll have me, I'd like to be your family, your real family." The boy's smile was brighter than the morning sun as he threw his arms around Lonely Rancher's neck. "I'd like that too." Martha wiped her eyes as she watched the embrace. "Well, I suppose that settles it. Deadwood's got itself a new family, and from the looks of things, they're going to fit right in." Father McKenna nodded approvingly. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to show people what really matters. This town learned something important today about standing up for what's right." As the weeks that followed would prove, the events of that night had indeed changed Deadwood forever. Judge Morrison and Sheriff Bradley were convicted and sentenced to prison, their corruption finally brought to light. The town elected new leadership, honest men and women who served the community rather than their own interests. Tommy thrived in his new life, attending the town school and making friends with children who accepted him without question. Martha became like a grandmother to him, while Father McKenna provided guidance and wisdom. And Lonely Rancher discovered that opening his heart to love again didn't make him vulnerable. It made him stronger. The man who had once lived on the margins of society became one of Deadwood's most respected citizens. He and Tommy built a small ranch on the outskirts of town, where they raised cattle and horses together. The lonely cowboy had found his family, and the abandoned child had found his home. On quiet evenings, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset over the Black Hills, Tommy would sometimes ask about that night in Devil's Cave. Lonely Rancher would tell him the truth, that sometimes the darkest moments in our lives lead us to the greatest light, and that courage isn't about being unafraid, but about doing what's right even when you are afraid. The story of the Lonely Rancher and the boy he saved became legend in Deadwood, passed down through generations as a reminder that one person's courage can change an entire community. And in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving, it proved that love, justice, and redemption were always possible for those brave enough to fight for them. Tommy Morrison, no longer alone, no longer afraid, grew up to become a respected rancher and community leader himself, always remembering the lesson his adoptive father had taught him. That family isn't just about blood, but about the people who choose to stand by you when the world seems darkest. And in the end, that choice, to stand by each other, to protect the vulnerable, and to fight for what's right, transformed not just two lonely souls, but an entire town. The legacy of that transformation would endure long after the last echo of gunshots faded from Devil's Cave, a testament to the power of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.